Welcome to Radio Worldview. I'm August Huckabee. The Radio Worldview podcast exists to teach students to live and think with a biblical worldview so that they can serve Christ and lead the culture. Tune in every week for perspectives on the arts, current events, and how to apply a biblical worldview to every aspect of reality. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you enjoy the show. Well, welcome on the podcast, Mark. Good to have you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for making the trip down to Colorado to teach our students for a little bit this week. And I absolutely love it when we get to have guest faculty members here on the program, just because we kind of have our few that we have that kind of do the lion's share of the work throughout the year in terms of the podcast, but we get to have new faces on every now and then, and one of those is when Worldview Academy faculty members come into town. So thanks for taking the time to be here. So we wanted to talk a little bit today of tying something back to Worldview Academy, which was one of our cultural conversations that happened back in February, I think. Does that sound right?
Right.
Yeah, and what those are, can you give a rundown on what the cultural conversations are?
Yeah, it's one of the nice developments in the post-pandemic world when everything kind of went to Zoom and everybody got a lot more comfortable with hosting conferences and events on video. One of the things Worldview started doing was hosting these cultural conversations via Zoom, where we could gather a bunch of students that ordinarily we would only see at camp in the summer and get them together virtually to have, some sort of a topic of conversation. And so the cultural conversation that I did in February was on being a creative Christian in what we often think of as a cancel culture and the tensions involved in that. And so each cultural conversation takes one topic and tries to unpack it, and then the participants get to ask questions, and we do our best to kind of interact with those questions. So I talked about creativity for about 25 minutes, and then for about an hour after that we answered questions.
Great. Wow. That's awesome. I didn't realize. I thought it was more of a longer lecture form. So that's awesome.
It varies. It varies. Depending on who's talking, it can be a very long lecture. Sure. But in this case, that was more or less the balance. And you can go to worldview.org and see all of the past conversations and actually watch those videos and experience that for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really gravitated towards this topic today for us because you're a novelist, you've written several books, and I'm a musician, at least part-time, and play a fair amount of live music and put out one album. And you've written how many novels now?
Oh, that's a great question. So 4 novels that have been published, and then others that have not yet been published, and at least one that will never be published, maybe more than one.
Yeah. And those are crime fiction, is that right?
Yeah, for the most part, or either crime or crime adjacent.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and so I just really kind of jumped at that opportunity to talk with you about that, because I think what at least I'm used to in the worldview context is talking about books or topics that have direct relevance to apologetics or to worldviews or to abortion, and I feel like we focus on some of these Christian or social issues specifically, instead of actually going into the realm of fiction or creativity or storytelling in some ways.
I mean, one of the things that happens to us all the time at leadership camps is anytime you give a talk that is about creativity, the arts, anything like that, you are swamped with students afterwards who have creative gifts themselves. Yeah. And they have lots of questions about how to use those gifts as a Christian. And those questions run the gamut. Like it can be, more sort of cultural stuff, like how do I do this in this cultural context? But it can also be really practical, how do I write a story? How do I finish this? Or I think music is a great example too, where some musicians are thinking, how do I make it big and become famous? And others are like, how do I play my instrument better? And the whole spectrum of topics under that heading of creativity. And you're right, it's something that we often don't address directly. Yeah. But there's a huge desire
Right.
to explore those things more.
Yeah, and I think, I totally agree. So I have a talk that I've started giving kind of on Christianity and the arts, and talk about a career in the arts and just looking at it in a more kind of disciplined way.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I do it, I try when I'm giving that talk to almost give permission to students to think this way.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like growing up, like nobody in my family is a professional artist. I don't even know of any, really. And so it was just very outside my cultural context to even think about creating something that I could make money off of, or could potentially be a career, or even a hobby,
Right.
And so it's just been awesome. Every time I've given that lecture, I have a student come up to me and say, hey, I really have this passion, or I really enjoy doing this. What steps do I take, or what do I do? And just giving them permission, like kind of giving them permission through that lecture, it seems like really empowers them to be vocal about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of students kind of hide that sometimes within our kind of somewhat conservative Christian context.
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of a gulf between the idea of like divine gifts and then like practical, what kind of job are you going to get concerns.
Yeah.
And a lot of time we focus on the practical stuff.
Yeah.
And certainly in education, you're constantly asking yourself, how do I prepare a student to go out into the world and make their own way and be successful, and all of those questions. But sometimes you need to look at it differently, and you need to ask yourself, certainly as a Christian, what gifts has God given me? Because any gift he's given you, he intends you to use.
Yeah.
And so if he's given you creative gifts, then part of your calling is to use those gifts.
Right.
And now you've got a whole set of questions that you need to start asking yourself.
Go along with that.
Yeah, like how do I do that? And
Right.
And honestly, those questions go all the way from what you might think of as very abstract theological, philosophical questions down to just really practical.
Very practical.
How do you make this work?
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel that way, like for my story, like I feel that way about songwriting. And like I just have loved music growing up, and I don't always think you should follow your passion. Like I don't always think that's the best career advice. But with music, I just find that I wake up thinking in lyrics sometimes. And it's just really odd, and I can write sometimes, and it's just like it naturally will start to rhyme. And I just look at that, and I'm just like, okay, this seems like other people don't do this in some ways. Like this seems like a unique thing kind of for me, and so how do I be faithful with this?
Right.
And like you said, that goes into okay, do I write only Christian songs, or can I write country songs too? But also is it okay to make money off of this and try to pursue it as a side hustle or as a business,
Right.
as opposed to just something that I write and nobody's going to hear, which I know other people who do that as well. you know? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, you kind of mentioned your cultural conversation was Christians, creativity, and in a cancel culture, right? So what was some of the main thought behind that topic?
Yeah, so what I was really trying to get at there is that I think we should look at the creative gifts that God has given us in a positive way. That in Christian theology, culture is a positive. Like God has made human beings to create culture. This is what Adam and Eve did in the garden. They were cultivators. And so all of us, in one way or another, are given these gifts so that we might build a culture that's glorifying to God. So instead of thinking of these gifts as impractical things, frivolous things that need to be set off to the side, we actually need to cultivate them and be good stewards of them the way that we would of any gift that God had given us. So that's one aspect, having a positive view of our gifting and the call to cultural contribution.
Sure.
But then the other side is, what do you do about the fact that the culture we actually live in is often hostile towards Christian expressions of culture?
Right.
And how do you navigate that? Because it's easy to say, I don't care what the culture thinks. I'm just going to, represent the truth. But if you're trying to make a living doing this, you suddenly find yourself asking, wait, how does that work exactly?
Yeah, it's kind of the classic artist question in some ways.
Right, and it's a legitimate question. And I think what happens is, and this is one of the things I try to emphasize, is that creativity and artistic endeavor is a lot more like work than it is like self-expression.
Yeah.
You know, we have a sort of fluffy way of thinking about artistic work as if it's not hard, as if it doesn't require discipline, as if it's just the result of inspiration.
Right.
It just comes to you or whatever. The reality is, for anyone who pursues this kind of a calling, there's a lot of work involved.
Right.
And there is a lot more in common between, let's say, a sculptor and an accountant than you would realize.
Yeah.
You know, there's differences, but there's also, you still got to get up and put in the hours, and there's a lot of similarities.
So where does that come from, right? So in the lecture that I give, I kind of say, it just seems like, I don't know if it's an American narrative or where that idea comes from of arts being just kind of this fluffy self-expression thing. And I just say, like, okay, we look at TV shows like American Idol or The Voice, and we kind of say, like, oh, your talent is something that needs to be discovered, and then when you get discovered, then fame is your validity as an artist.
Right.
And it just seems like it's all really fast, doesn't require a lot of discipline. You just show up one day and you get discovered. And as I've just done more and more research on stories of artists, I've just found that to be so untrue. Just that there's a moment where maybe someone takes a spotlight, but behind that is a team of people. It's a lot of years of practice. It's a family that was willing to like relocate to a better spot for them to be successful. I mean, there's just a lot of like sacrifice behind it, but we don't think of it that way.
Right.
So what do you think? Why is that?
Well, yeah, so you mentioned American Idol. I think there's probably no television show better named than that, because that is what it's about. You know, it's not about being successful, it's about becoming an idol. Like, so there's a subtext of, theologically speaking, idolatry that revolves around this, and it's most evident, I think, early on, because the thing that I think gave that television show its early popularity wasn't who's going to win. It was, look at all these crazy people who show up for auditions thinking they're great, when in fact they have no talent.
Right.
And in those instances, you see very starkly a person driven by a desire for fame and recognition, regardless of talent.
Right.
Maybe even unwilling to put in the work.
Yeah.
And we delight in seeing that sort of pretension humbled.
Sure.
But at the same time, we subscribe to it. You know, and I think that's, with all creativity, there's a kind of myth, and I think maybe it comes at least from Romanticism. You know, there's a time, you think of like the Middle Ages, where artists were artisans.
Yeah.
And they did skilled labor the way that carpenters did and things like that. But it wasn't like they were seen as these kind of egomaniacal geniuses. Sure. Right? That starts happening, you know, you get like Michelangelo and I think there's a great story that Paul Johnson tells in his book Intellectuals about Goethe and Beethoven. And they're at some minor German court of some prince, and they're walking along, and a group of noblemen walks in the other direction. Goethe, who's from an earlier generation, steps aside to let them go forward, even though he's the greatest writer in the German language. Beethoven keeps walking, and the princes have to part so that Beethoven can go through. And then afterwards, supposedly, Goethe, you know, remonstrates with Beethoven, says, hey, those were princes, you know, you're supposed to step aside. Yeah. And Beethoven supposedly says, Germany has 1,000 princes and it only has one Beethoven. You know, and I think in that, whether it's a true story or not, you get sort of the birth of kind of the myth of the artistic genius. Right. And forever after, that's kind of the way it works, where you might write a song, or I might write a book, a story, and the question we're asking ourselves after we've done it is it great? Is it a work of genius? Right. And you'll only really know once it's out there and people respond, right? Like if they bow down and say this is a work of genius, then you've done it.
Yeah.
And we act as if it's unpredictable in that way. Like
Yeah.
there's no relationship between hard work, effort, discipline, and the outcome.
Right.
When the reality is, Beethoven, Mozart, whoever, extraordinary gifts, but also an incredible amount of effort at stewarding those gifts.
Right.
A lot of work that went into it. And so I think we want to cultivate whatever gifts God gives us. That involves a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess, my point in my talk, and anytime we talk about this, is I want to encourage people to be willing to do the work and discourage people who are more interested in the identity than in the work.
Right.
So in writing, I'd often say, you will meet a lot more people who want to be writers than people who want to write. And I think in music you have something similar. There are a lot more people who want to be rock stars than who want to perform music.
Right.
Performing the music or writing the stories is just the means to the end.
Right.
But the end for a lot of people is the fame, the recognition.
Right.
And so
kind of the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think as long as your goal is the recognition, it's better not to pursue these things.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not encouraging people who want to become famous to go out and pursue a life of creativity so that perhaps they can become famous.
Yeah.
I want to encourage the people who have a desire to do the work for the sake of the work, the people who want to write songs to bring beauty into the world and glorify God with them.
Yeah.
That's what you want to encourage. And so it's, I think, a little bit of a different calculus where I know as a parent, you might look at a child and say, I want to equip this child to succeed in life. This child says that he wants to do something creative. He wants to be a musician or a writer. I'm going to support that, but I'm going to encourage him to go to law school first. And then he'll have something to fall back on, right? And that's often the way we think about it very practically.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm saying maybe we need a different way of looking at these things, in the same way that if we recognize in a young person a call into ministry, and there's a certain point where you have dreams for your child, but you recognize God has other plans, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to support this. I think that's true for creative gifts as well, that we want to see what God has given to a person and how they're going to use those gifts and be supportive of that process of discovering it.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So how does the cancel culture piece kind of tie in? Are you kind of leaning towards the bravery and truth kind of a thing?
I think what it does is it places the whole conversation in a larger context of fear.
Yeah.
Because it becomes a reason to edit yourself.
Suppress, right? Maybe?
Exactly. Yeah. I think that there's like a line of thought in creativity that is that you need to work hard to eliminate your internal editor, right? That your best work will come once you stop kind of holding back.
Right.
When you're truly honest. I think as a Christian, there's a sense in which that resonates. That for Christians living in a culture that is, to one degree or another, in some ways hostile, in some ways just not welcoming.
Yeah, maybe indifferent.
Right. Like there's all, we can argue, in different cases how bad things are, but when you're in that context, the main effect to worry about is what you internalize. The main, in a context of persecution, the main thing to worry about if you were actually being persecuted is not that people might harm me. It's that because of the fear of being harmed, I might remain silent.
Right.
So what we want to cultivate is a truthfulness regardless of the circumstances, right? So that means not allowing your fear of not being accepted in the world to prevent you from telling the truth in your work. And that's a hard thing, I think.
Yeah.
it feels easy in the context of the church to say, well, of course I would tell the truth. Of course I would do that. But then you run into the reality of if this is a job, like if I'm trying to support myself, then I need as many people as possible to read my books or to listen to my music.
Right.
And
actually need someone to engage with it.
Right. And then you start worrying, like,
Right.
you know, I mean, I don't want to offend people unnecessarily, and I don't, you know, I need to be careful about, you know, how I say this, and I think you shouldn't offend people unnecessarily, and you should be careful about what you say, but not out of fear, out of a desire to do things well, and that's very different. And so I think we have a tendency now to overcorrect and to be much more conscious of all of the different ways that you might accidentally be canceled. Mm-hmm. And it leads us to not want to explore the many facets of truth that we actually have in our faith. And so I kind of did in my talk, and this is a work in progress. So I'm not saying this is the perfect way to think about it, but if you think about a three-legged stool, right, to support the weight of an artistic calling, one of the legs of that stool is craft, which is beauty in form. And I think that's one that Christians need to care a lot about. Yeah. That it's not just, you know, glorifying God, but it's glorifying Him in our action, not just in our words. Right? Like doing everything we do really well. Like do the music that we do with excellence. Yeah. The writing with excellence. So that's one, craft. Mm-hmm. Truth is the second one. So the beauty of the content. Yeah. Not being afraid to say what is true. Not being afraid to challenge the assumptions of the world around us. Not feeling like we have to go along with the flow. One of the things you hear a lot of in young artists is the idea that I want to be the voice of my generation. That I want to sort of speak for my people, my time, that sort of thing. To represent those people in that way. I get that. And yet, I think for an artist, it's important to be willing to go against that. Yeah. Like sometimes you have to swim against the tide. Sometimes you can't just go along with the flow. And I think especially as a Christian, you've got to be careful about that. That I don't want to just swim with the flow of, let's say, the Christian community. I want to actually think hard about my faith. But I also don't want to just swim with the tide of the culture. I definitely don't want to do that. Yeah. And I think, you know, the greatest artists have always been the ones who have been willing to not just go along, not just imitate or parrot, not just tell people what they want to hear. So,
yeah, but I think there's also a piece to that where it's like you want to know or choose your battles, right?
Yeah, sure.
So, like, you think so like with craft, I don't want to get too stuck on this before we cut you off or anything, but like, there's an idea of like learning the form of a novel or of a song and melody and like how to put it together. There's kind of what I would call like the mechanical pieces. And then there's like lyrics. And I think that it's like you just want to pick your battles, right? Like you don't want to, it's like if your first work is so far out of left field, then people won't even engage with it because it's so far from what they know. But at the same time, but you can make something, I don't know, that's like similar to what they're familiar with, while at the same time sticking to truth, that makes it maybe more palatable. Yeah. And then you kind of move someone along, or you move your audience along to something different.
I think you're describing two different strategies, both of which can work. Yeah. You know, like I can totally imagine one kind of person saying, you know what, left field is where I live. Yeah. And I'm going to do work that is so idiosyncratic that there just isn't anything like it, but it reflects my vision. And that can completely miss its audience, but sometimes it finds it. Right. You know, it's not like Tolkien was saying, hey, I want to get on this fantasy trend and really slide in some truth on the back of it. He was just completely out there, and somehow it found its audience and it worked, and it created an audience in a sense. But at the same time, that second strategy is also a really good strategy, where I'm thinking about essentially I'm going to depart from the status quo in one area, but I'm going to earn the right to do it by giving you what you expect in another area.
Right.
And these are artistic strategies. And,
Yeah.
and I think one thing Christians, as they think about creativity, need to recognize is that a variety of strategies might be valid, and a lot depends on the individual artist, their vision, their abilities. It's not a question of saying, well, this is the biblical way, and that is not.
Sure. Good point.
These are more, battle tactics than that higher level stuff. But I will say, I do think there's one area where we can say there is a mandate. Like, it's regardless of your strategy.
Sure.
There's one thing, and it's this third leg of the stool. I call it opposition. But if we're talking about beauty in form and beauty in content, opposition is, I think it is like beauty versus death. That you have to recognize that the culture apart from Christ is spinning in the opposite direction of life. And so whether your strategy is a subtle one or an in-your-face one, at its root, there has to be this recognition of that opposition, right? That the reason that I'm not going to ultimately go with the flow is that the flow is sort of spinning towards death and destruction.
Yeah.
And in whatever way, whether it's subtle or in your face, I'm going to push back in the other direction, in the direction of beauty, in the direction of life.
Yeah.
And I think that can be the sort of starting point that helps us know, like, we've got a fundamental orientation as believers that we have in common, but how we pursue it could look very different depending on our abilities, circumstances, calling, all of that.
Interesting. I feel like I could unpack that for a while.
Yeah.
So when you say towards life, like what would some examples of that be? Like biblical principles? I mean, is that like, where does that go?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, if you want like the big picture of where it goes, for me, it goes to the idea of truth in all of its aspects. So, we said before, I've written crime novels, and in my crime novels, I've tried to tell the truth about the world, but it's not the whole truth.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that I'm addressing every single aspect of reality. It's selective. I've chosen certain aspects of the world to really engage with, and I've come at them with Christian ideas in mind. And so I've written stories where I've sort of taken theological ideas and influences and channeled them into fiction, sort of embodied them in the narrative.
Right.
In order to arrive at truth. And that's kind of how fiction works. We take ideas, we embody them in narrative, and the result is truth.
Right.
It's different from the scientific method, but the artistic method is another way of trying to go in at truth and recognizing, oh yeah, this is how the world is. So in that sense, the push for beauty is a push for like a truthful message, let's say, or truthful ideas for a good form. And when I say a good form, let's say like a form that corresponds to the structure of creation, which is basically like everything that God has made has a structure to it and a direction. So the direction part is like the truth seeking. Like, I want to do things that glorify God, that point towards Him.
Yeah.
But the structure part is the how the world works thing. But that's also created.
Yeah.
So a scientist goes out and he asks himself, how does the cosmos function? And the answer to that question is revealing the structure of creation.
Yeah.
A musician asks that question about music. You look at the musical notations, the notes, you say, how does this function? And although we're accustomed to thinking of that as like self-expression,
Right.
I'm going to strum out a tune to kind of express my heart. When you start thinking about what music is and realizing that there is an objectivity to it,
Right. Definitely.
you start to feel as if music is sometimes doing science more than it's doing art.
Yeah. Right.
And so I think that's how we pursue this in the big picture. Like, we're chasing after God in both ways. So I want my ideas to be kind of chasing after that truth, but I also want my work, the stuff I'm doing, to be chasing after that God-given structure, doing things the way they're meant to be done.
Right. Yeah. So in a talk that Jeff put together before, Jeff Baldwin, and that I've kind of carried on, he talks about two kind of elements of art, those being form and content.
Right.
Right. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Yeah. And so when I say content, I usually mean lyrics or the words of the story and kind of the truth that you end up at. But then there's also the form. And like when I talk about that in my lecture, I'm like, there's the artist who wants to be a musician who's recording on his iPhone at home, right? And it's like that's maybe good content but bad form. And they're not to like a professional level of excellent execution in all these ways. And like excellent execution is what we want as Christians, right? Like ultimately, because we are trying to reflect art in its highest form. And so it's not just about the content or that piece of truth at the end of the story. It's also about how you get there, right? It's the way that you write the words. It's the way that you build the story. And that should follow some good, like that should follow some maybe not time-honored, but at least some good structural principles, right?
Exactly. And I think music is a great analogy because, like, if you have like a favorite song, it comes on the radio, and you start singing that song. In that experience, you don't separate between the notes and the lyrics. Right. There's just flows. A perfect correspondence there, and it's hard to imagine different words to those sounds. But if you then go back to like the hymnal, you recognize that in Christian worship, there's this tradition of like one tune being used for a variety of different sets of lyrics.
Yeah.
And another thing, I mean, everyone listening, I think, can relate to this because we do it so much in worship today, where we take old hymns and set them to new music.
Yep.
Right? We have lyrics that are just incredibly profound, but when you sing them to the original music, they're not so great.
Right.
Some of those old tunes, not so singable anymore.
Right.
And when someone comes along and sets them to a music that fits them better or fits us better,
right,
that changes that relationship.
Better. Yeah.
Right. So on the one hand, we can distinguish between the music and the lyrics, between the form and the content. But on the other, we have this intuition that in an ideal world, they go together.
Right.
And they support one another. And so I think that's a good way to think of this. Like the artist is working on his ability so that the form is as good as it can be. Yeah. But he's also working on his ideas and his sort of view of the world so that the content reflects that beauty too.
Yeah, it's good. So kind of going into a little bit of a wrapping up segment, what does it mean to like, how do you define success, right? If there's students out there who are listening today and they are thinking, okay, well, this is, I feel this calling, or I feel like I want to be an artist, or I love music or writing or whatever, what does it look like to try to pursue that and maybe define success kind of within a modern context?
Yeah, I think for the vast majority of people, the one word answer to that is bivocational.
Yeah.
That a lot of people pursue creative callings believing that they're somehow going to do this for a living exclusively.
Yeah.
The reality is that most people who actually sustain creative work over time are doing it part-time.
Yeah.
And are doing other work instead. That may be teaching, it may be some other kind of work, but what that does is it frees them to pursue their artistic calling without having to think first and foremost in terms of like making it a product that can be sold.
Right.
In some cases, that's not how it works. There are some people who are able to work in that space as their full-time profession. I think probably the best approach is to assume that won't be the case for you, so that you will have to have some kind of a bivocational plan in order to keep this going, but that it may be possible more and more, depending on circumstances and on your developing skill set, that you might do your creative work as most or even all of your work.
Yeah.
So that advice about going to law school for the fallback, it's not entirely wrong.
Sure.
There is some wisdom in having that kind of a broader preparation. But the reason is in order to be able to do what you've been called to do, just like there were a lot of people in ministry who work bivocationally, and the job that they do so that they're free to pursue ministry in the way that it needs to be pursued, because not all ministries, just like not all businesses, are profitable.
Right.
So if you go into it with that in mind, I think you're starting in a good place. And some forms of creativity, that's easier than others. You know, if you are a poet, you probably already know you're not going to become a millionaire just by writing poetry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, if you are, let's say, a violinist, right? You're probably not going to become a famous top 40 rock star violinist. That's not a thing, really. So certain kinds of disciplines already have a degree of this built into them. Others, though, less so. You know, writing novels, there is always that thought at the back of your mind that, well, maybe this next book will be a bestseller, and I'll just do this all the time for the rest of my life. Or with music, you know, this next song will blow up, and this will change everything, and I'll have people throwing contracts at me, and you know, all of that, none of which is bad.
Right.
But I think the danger is if you pursue that as the dream, behind it there are a lot of little compromises. Like once you start chasing after that kind of validation or recognition, or like rolling the dice in hopes of fame as the outcome, you start changing what you're doing.
Right.
If you pursue your calling in its integrity, like if you say to yourself, I'm doing this the way Bach did it, Soli Deo Gloria. I'm doing it for God's glory, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And if, as a result of that, it's successful and I'm able to do it full time, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But I didn't change what it was to try to get there.
Right.
And so that to me is just the fundamental approach.
Yeah. When I went through the recording process with these songs, I'd written probably 200 songs and tried to pick 6 that I felt like would be, or I think it was 8 actually, that I think would be like people would express like what I was trying to do with music, but would also be somewhat close to what people knew, so that basically they wouldn't be so different that people just wouldn't engage with them. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just this idea, kind of what you're talking about, of in that recording process, you have to constantly ask this question, like, okay, do I add this instrument? Do I add this feel to it? Or does that take away from what the song is trying to be?
Right.
Because at some level, you just have to ask, or you have to say, this, I'm going to try to make this as pure of a thing as possible, right? Whether that's a story or a novel or a piece of music. And then it's like, for me, it was like afterwards, like, okay, now I'm going to do the marketing. But I had to really try to segment those things in my mind so as to not get so distracted or even buried in anxiety over like this being marketable, right, or commercial, as opposed to it being like truly what I felt like it should be.
Yeah,
and
I
think
think
it was created to be.
You know, as people are hearing this, the kind of thing it's trying to be is a good way of putting it, because not everything is trying to be like great art, let's say.
Yeah, true.
Like it's legitimate to write a story that is designed to entertain people.
Yeah.
And you would make choices that are aimed at making it more entertaining, and that's not selling out or compromising. That's trying to say, okay, this is the kind of thing this is.
Yeah. I'm
going to make it the best kind of thing like that I can make it.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's easy to you know, take shots at pop music, let's say.
And country pop.
It's like, oh yeah, you know, so you know a chord, and you know, but at the same time, at a certain level, you have to recognize like that pop object is a certain kind of thing that's done a certain way, and bringing an intensity to it that's not sort of right for it might actually be the wrong choice. So all that just to say that none of these choices about how you approach it condition the outcome.
Right.
Like none of them say, well, Christians should only do serious work and they should never do anything frivolous or humorous or whatever. None of those questions are being addressed here. We're just talking about how you do the work, whatever the work is. And I think, you can write something light and comic to the glory of God. And I think you can record a 3-minute pop song to the glory of God as well.
Yeah.
Just don't ask me how to do it, because I don't personally know, but I think it's possible to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that, and I think where we kind of ended was, in terms of success, is trying, like we said, to just be pure to the thing that you're trying to create. Right. And ultimately, in terms of success, like what I try to do is, with any given song, try to allow it to be what I feel like it wants to be, which is a funny way of saying it, and it just sounds a little bit intangible, which I get.
But I think to people doing it, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it's intangible if you're not in the act of doing it. But once you try it, you'll suddenly see, oh yeah, I get it.
Yeah. You can try to force something to be something that it's not.
Yeah.
And it just feels clunky. And
I think, it's common sense. Like if you ask me what makes a worship service successful,
sure,
I would say, well, was God worshipped? Was he glorified? And if the answer to that is yes, then that was, quote unquote, a successful service.
Yeah.
But there's another way of answering that question, which is how many people showed up. Right? We could say it was a successful service because there were this many people.
Right.
And if there were only this many people, maybe it wasn't so successful. So we could rate it based on the numbers. And I think when it comes to artistic production, we do the very same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Was it a successful song? Well, how many people downloaded it?
Right.
Was it a successful book? How many people bought it? Chasing numbers. But ultimately, the liberating realization is that it was successful if it glorified God.
Right.
And that's the audience that matters. That's whose eyes matter. And if you pursue the use of any of your gifts with that in mind, there's a great freedom that comes with that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, anything else to add? I feel like that's a pretty good spot to land it for the day, if that works.
I think
for
you should just have people send in their songs and stories, and we can let them know if they're glorifying God or not.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks again for being on today, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks again for joining us. For more information about our Worldview Academy summer camps, go to worldview.org. And for more information about our Gap Year program for college freshman students, go to worldviewbridgeyear.com. Thanks again. Hope we'll see you soon.